It was a rainy Tuesday morning in March when Dr. Sarah Chen received the phone call that would change everything she thought she knew about one of nature's most bizarre creatures. The marine biologist had been studying platypuses in the rivers of eastern Australia for nearly 15 years, dedicating her entire career to understanding these peculiar, egg-laying mammals that seemed to defy every rule of evolutionary biology. But nothing in her extensive education or years of fieldwork had prepared her for what she was about to discover. Before I dive into this absolutely mind-blowing story that shocked the entire scientific community and touched the hearts of millions of people around the world, I need you to do something for me right now. Drop a comment below, telling me what city or country you're watching this video from, because I want to know where all you amazing people are tuning in from. And while you're down there in the comments, go ahead and smash that like button, because I promise you this story is going to take you on an emotional roller coaster that you'll be thinking about for days. And you're definitely going to want to share it with everyone you know once you hear how incredible this journey becomes. So stick with me through every moment, because what happens is absolutely extraordinary. Dr. Sarah Chen, a woman of 42 with kind brown eyes that crinkled at the corners, from years of squinting at research data and long hours in the field, had always been fascinated by platypuses from the moment she first learned about them as a child growing up in Sydney. These extraordinary creatures, with their duck-like bills, beaver-like tails, otter-like feet, and venomous spurs, represented one of nature's most confounding puzzles. So strange that when the first preserved specimen was sent to European scientists in 1798, they literally thought it was a hoax, that someone had sewn together parts from different animals as an elaborate practical joke. Even today, with all our advanced scientific knowledge and genetic sequencing capabilities, platypuses continue to baffle researchers with their unique combination of mammalian, reptilian, and avian characteristics. And Sarah had devoted her life to unraveling their mysteries, particularly focusing on their remarkable electroreception abilities that allowed them to hunt underwater with their eyes, ears, and nostrils completely closed, navigating entirely by detecting the electrical fields generated by the muscle contractions of their prey. The call came from James Patterson, a park ranger Sarah had worked with for over a decade in the wilderness areas along the upper tributaries of the Snowy River, a rugged and remote region where human presence was minimal and platypus populations, while never abundant, due to their naturally low numbers and specific habitat requirements, had remained relatively stable over the years. James's voice on the phone carried an urgency that immediately put Sarah on alert, and his words came tumbling out in a rush that suggested something truly unusual had occurred. He had discovered a platypus, he explained, but this wasn't just any platypus behaving in typical platypus fashion, burrowing into riverbanks and hunting for freshwater crustaceans and insect larvae in the murky water. This particular individual, a mature male based on the prominent venomous spurs on his hind legs, was doing something that James had never witnessed in 30 years of working. In these mountains, something that seemed to go against everything documented in scientific literature about platypus behavior and social structure, something that suggested a level of intelligence and emotional capacity that even the most ardent defenders of animal cognition had never attributed to these solitary, seemingly primitive creatures. Sarah grabbed her research equipment, threw supplies into her weathered Land Rover that had seen more mud than pavement over the years, and made the 3-hour drive from her laboratory at the university to the remote location James had described, her mind racing through possibilities of what could be so unusual about this platypus's behavior that it warranted such an urgent summons. The rain had intensified during her drive, turning the narrow dirt roads into treacherous channels of mud that required every ounce of her considerable off-road driving experience to navigate. but she pressed on, driven by that particular combination of scientific curiosity and intuition that had guided her throughout her career. The feeling that something significant was waiting to be discovered if she could just get there in time to observe it. When she finally arrived at the coordinates James had provided, pulling her vehicle to a stop near a small clearing beside a bend in the river where the water ran deep and slow, perfect platypus habitat, she found the ranger waiting for her with an expression on his weathered face that was equal parts wonder and concern. James led Sarah down a steep embankment, both of them sliding occasionally on the wet leaves and mud, until they reached a spot where the river curved around a massive fallen eucalyptus tree that had created a natural pool, its submerged branches providing the kind of complex underwater structure that platypuses favored for foraging. He pointed to a burrow entrance in the riverbank just above the waterline, but positioned where high water during floods would occasionally inundate it. And he handed Sarah his binoculars, directing her attention to a section of the river about 20 meters downstream from where they stood. What Sarah saw through those rain-spattered lenses made her breath catch in her throat, and her scientific training wore with her emotional response because there, swimming in methodical circles in the deeper water, was indeed a male platypus, his sleek brown fur creating a distinctive V-shaped wake as he moved through the water. But he wasn't alone, and what accompanied him was something that should have been impossible, something that violated every established understanding of platypus reproductive behavior and parental care, something that would, once documented and verified, require a fundamental reassessment of how scientists viewed these remarkable animals. Swimming beside the adult male, staying close to his larger body in a way that suggested both dependency and trust, was a juvenile platypus, probably no more than 4 or 5 months old based on its size, still possessing the slightly fuzzy appearance and awkward swimming coordination characteristic of young individuals who had only recently left their natal burrow. This in itself wasn't remarkable. Young platypuses existed and had to grow up somewhere. But what made Sarah's heart race and her scientist's mind reel was that this young platypus was not genetically related to the adult male. That much became clear from their subsequent observations and testing. And more importantly, the adult male was actively caring for the juvenile, teaching it to forage, protecting it from potential predators, and displaying a level of nurturing behavior that had never, in the entire history of platypus research spanning over 2 centuries, been documented in males of this species. Platypuses were supposed to be solitary, except during brief mating encounters. Females alone raised the young in their breeding burrows. Males had no involvement whatsoever in parental care and would, according to all available research, be more likely to be aggressive toward juveniles than protective of them. Yet here was irrefutable evidence of a male platypus that had somehow adopted an orphaned juvenile and was raising it as his own. Over the following weeks, Sarah essentially moved into a small research station near the site, a rustic cabin that the Park Service maintained for researchers, and she spent every available daylight hour and many nighttime hours using infrared cameras and other observation equipment, documenting the behavior of this extraordinary pair that she began referring to in her field notes as the teacher and the student. What she observed during those intensive weeks of study would eventually fill 3 comprehensive research papers, generate international media attention, spark fierce debates in academic circles about animal consciousness and emotion, and ultimately change how the scientific community understood not just platypuses, but the very nature of intelligence and compassion in animals that had previously been dismissed as operating purely on instinct, without the capacity for the kind of complex decision-making and emotional bonds that this adoption clearly represented. If you're finding this story as fascinating as I am, And if you want to hear more incredible true stories about animal behavior that challenges everything we think we know, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of the amazing content I share on this channel, because trust me, there's so much more to this story and you won't want to miss a single detail. The teacher, as Sarah called him, was a mature male, probably around 8 or 9 years old based on his size and the development of his spurs, making him middle-aged in platypus terms since they typically live 12 to 15 years in the wild. He was larger than average for the species, measuring about 55 centimeters from bill tip to tail tip, with particularly lustrous fur that suggested he was in excellent health and finding abundant food in his territory. The student was smaller, as expected for a juvenile, probably female based on the absence of spur development, though definitive sexing would have required capture and examination, which Sarah was reluctant to do given the delicate nature of the situation she was observing. What became clear through careful observation was that the student had somehow lost her mother, possibly to a fox attack or flooding, or one of the many dangers that claimed the lives of female platypuses attempting to raise their young. And rather than perishing as would be expected for such a young individual without parental care, she had somehow encountered the teacher, and he had, for reasons that continued to baffle Sarah, taken on the role of surrogate parent. The teaching behaviors Sarah documented were nothing short of remarkable. Each morning, usually around dawn when platypuses are most active, the teacher would emerge from his burrow, and the student would emerge from what appeared to be a separate but nearby burrow, and they would swim together to specific foraging sites where the teacher would demonstrate hunting techniques. Platypuses hunt by sweeping their bills back and forth along the river bottom, using their electroreceptors to detect the tiny electrical signals given off by the muscle contractions of prey items like fresh water, crayfish, aquatic insect larvae, and worms. The teacher would perform these sweeping motions in exaggerated, almost theatrical ways, moving more slowly and deliberately than would be typical for normal hunting, as if consciously trying to make his technique visible and understandable to his young charge. He would capture prey items and, rather than immediately consuming them as a solitary platypus would normally do, he would sometimes release them in front of the student, allowing her to recapture them and learn the feeling of a successful hunt, the way the prey would struggle, and how to handle it properly. The protection behaviors were equally fascinating and emotionally moving to witness. On several occasions, Sarah observed the teacher positioning himself between the student and potential threats, including once when a large water snake, itself a predator capable of taking young platypuses, appeared in their foraging area, and the teacher had used his body to shield the juvenile while making unusual vocalizations, a kind of low growling sound that Sarah had rarely heard from platypuses, warning the snake away. Platypuses are generally quite vocal animals despite popular belief to the contrary, making a variety of growling, clicking, and chattering sounds. But this particular vocalization seemed specifically designed to communicate threat and protection, and it was effective. The snake had moved away without confrontation. Another time, when a territorial dispute arose with another male platypus who had ventured into their area, the teacher had been unusually aggressive, an extreme reaction that made sense only in the context of protecting the vulnerable juvenile rather than simply defending foraging rights, which would typically be handled through more ritualized displays rather than actual physical confrontation. The emotional bond between the two platypuses became increasingly evident as Sarah's observations continued. They would rest together on a partially submerged log during breaks in their foraging sessions, something that was unusual enough given that platypuses typically rest alone in their burrows between hunting periods. But what really struck Sarah was the way they would groom each other, the teacher carefully cleaning the student's fur with his bill in a gentle, methodical way that was remarkably similar to the grooming behavior female platypuses use with their puggles, as baby platypuses are called in one of nature's most delightful terminologies. The student, for her part, would follow the teacher everywhere, maintaining close physical proximity that suggested not just dependency, but genuine attachment, and she would often nuzzle against him in what appeared to be displays of affection, behaviors that were being documented on camera and would eventually provide irrefutable evidence that something profound and previously unknown was occurring. Sarah's documentation of this relationship attracted the attention of other researchers, and soon a small team of scientists had assembled to study this unprecedented case of adoption in a species previously thought to be incapable of such behavior. Dr. Michael Roberts, a behavioral ecologist from the University of Melbourne who had published extensively on monotremes behavior, arrived with sophisticated tracking equipment and genetic sampling tools. Dr. Yuki Tanaka, a comparative psychologist from Kyoto University who specialized in studying cognition in egg-laying mammals, brought her expertise in designing observational protocols that could tease apart instinctive behaviors from learned and intentional actions. Together with Sarah, they conducted a comprehensive study that would span 6 months and produce data that would fundamentally challenge existing paradigms about animal intelligence, emotion, and the evolutionary origins of parental care behaviors. The genetic testing confirmed what behavioral observations had suggested. The teacher and student were not related. DNA samples collected from shed fur and other biological materials found in their respective burrows showed no familial connection, ruling out the possibility that this was simply a case of a male caring for his own offspring, which, while still unusual for platypuses, would have been easier to explain within existing theoretical frameworks about kin selection and genetic investment in one's own offspring. The fact that the teacher had adopted an unrelated juvenile meant that his behavior couldn't be explained by the drive to ensure the survival of his own genes, the traditional evolutionary explanation for parental care. Instead, it suggested something more complex: the capacity for empathy, for recognizing the vulnerability and need of another individual, and for making what could only be described as a conscious choice to help, even at considerable cost to himself in terms of time, energy, and resources that could have been devoted to his own survival and future reproductive success. The research team set up motion-activated cameras throughout the teacher's territory, covering multiple burrow entrances, foraging sites, and travel routes between them, creating a comprehensive record of how he allocated his time and how the adoption had affected his daily routine. The data revealed that the teacher was spending approximately 40% more time foraging than the average for solitary males in the area, suggesting he was catching extra food to provision the student, even though by this age she should theoretically have been capable of feeding herself entirely. Analysis of his body condition through photogrammetric techniques showed that he had lost approximately 8% of his body mass since the adoption began, indicating that the extra effort was indeed costly to him personally. Yet he continued the behavior day after day, week after week, with no sign of abandoning his adopted charge, even though doing so would have immediately improved his own condition and survival prospects. Perhaps the most remarkable observations came during what the researchers began calling teaching sessions, specific periods where the teacher's behavior seemed clearly designed to transmit knowledge rather than simply forage efficiently. In one memorable sequence captured on video that would later go viral online and be viewed by millions of people around the world, the teacher spent nearly 20 minutes repeatedly demonstrating how to open freshwater mussels, a valuable and protein-rich food source that requires technique to access without injury from the sharp shell edges. He would crack open a mussel consume the contents, then find another one and perform the same action in slow motion while the student watched intently from less than a meter away, her small bill pointed directly at his actions. On the third demonstration, he opened the mussel but didn't eat it, instead pushing it toward the student with his bill, encouraging her to consume it. On subsequent mussels, he would start the opening process, then stop halfway through, allowing her to finish it, and learn the motor patterns required for this difficult skill. This sequence was repeated over multiple days, showing a clear pedagogical structure, moving from demonstration to assisted practice to independent performance with supervision. The story of the teacher and student began to spread beyond the scientific community when Sarah presented preliminary findings at an international conference on animal behavior in Brisbane. A journalist attending the conference wrote an article about the research that was picked up by major news outlets, and suddenly the story of the adoptive platypus was appearing in newspapers, websites, and television news programs around the world. People were captivated by this tale of an unusual creature, already famous for being odd, now revealing depths of character and capability that resonated with something fundamental in human experience: the capacity to care for others beyond the boundaries of biological relationship or even species, to recognize need and respond with compassion and sustained commitment. The research station where Sarah was working was flooded with requests for interviews. Documentary film crews wanted to capture footage of the platypuses, and conservation organizations saw an opportunity to highlight the importance of protecting platypus habitat by connecting people emotionally to these remarkable animals. Sarah was careful to balance public interest with the welfare of her research subjects, allowing only carefully controlled media access that wouldn't disturb the platypuses or interfere with their natural behaviors. A BBC documentary crew spent 2 weeks in the area using long-range lenses and non-invasive techniques to capture stunning footage of the teacher and student going about their daily routines, swimming through shafts of sunlight penetrating the clear river water, grooming each other on their favorite log, the teacher patiently demonstrating foraging techniques while the student watched and learned. The resulting documentary, titled The Platypus Father, aired to an audience of over 15 million viewers in the UK alone, and was subsequently distributed internationally, winning several awards for wildlife filmmaking and doing more to raise public awareness about platypus conservation than decades of previous efforts had achieved. As months passed and winter gave way to spring in the Australian bush, the student grew steadily larger and more competent, her foraging skills improving to the point where she was catching probably 90% of her own food, though she and the teacher still foraged together most days and continued to show clear signs of their bond through grooming, resting in proximity, and coordinated movements through their shared territory. Sarah and her colleagues documented the student's development meticulously, creating a detailed record of how a young platypus learned the skills necessary for survival. Data that was valuable not just for understanding this unique adoption case, but for improving conservation efforts generally, since successful release of rescued or relocated platypuses required understanding exactly what skills they needed and how those skills were normally acquired. The student was learning everything she needed to know to survive as an independent adult, not from her biological mother who had been lost to unknown circumstances, but from an unrelated male who had chosen to take on this role despite having no apparent evolutionary incentive to do so. The research also revealed something unexpected about the teacher's own history. Analysis of his territory and burrow locations, combined with genetic sampling of other platypuses in the area, suggested that the teacher had never successfully reproduced, despite being of prime breeding age and occupying good, quality habitat. There were several possible explanations for this: competition from other males, lack of available females, simple bad luck in the lottery of reproduction, but the result was that the teacher had no offspring of his own to care for, no direct genetic investment in the next generation. Some researchers speculated that this might have created a kind of emotional or behavioral void that the orphaned juvenile had filled, that the capacity for parental care, which must exist in the platypus genome, even if it was typically expressed only in females, had found an outlet in this unusual situation. Others argued that this was anthropomorphizing, projecting human psychological concepts onto an animal that might simply be responding to immediate stimuli without any complex emotional state involved. But those who spent time watching the teacher and student interact, who saw the gentleness and patience in his behavior, who observed how he would wait for her when she struggled to keep up, how he would position himself to break the current and give her easier swimming, found it difficult to deny that something more than mere stimulus response was at work here. As the one-year anniversary of Sarah's initial observation approached, the research team prepared to publish their findings in a series of papers that would comprehensively document this extraordinary case and its implications for understanding platypus behavior, monotreme evolution, and the broader questions of animal cognition and emotion that had been debated since Darwin first wrote about the expression of emotions in animals. The lead paper, authored by Sarah with her colleagues as co-authors, was titled Alloparental Care in the Platypus, a case study of cross-sex adoption and teaching behavior in Ornithorhynchus anatomus, and it would be published in the prestigious journal Nature, accompanied by an editorial discussing how unexpected observations in natural settings continue to reveal capabilities in animals that laboratory studies and theoretical models had failed to predict, and how this case joined a growing body of evidence that complex social cognition, empathy, and cultural transmission of knowledge were far more widespread in the animal kingdom than previously believed. The publication of Sarah's research sparked intense discussion in scientific circles and popular media alike. Some researchers questioned whether the behaviors observed really constituted teaching in the strict sense that comparative psychologists defined it, requiring evidence that the teacher modified their behavior in response to the student's performance, and that learning occurred more rapidly or thoroughly than it would through individual trial and error. Sarah and her team presented detailed statistical analyses showing that yes, the teacher did adjust his demonstrations based on the student's success or failure in previous attempts, and yes, comparison with data from other juvenile platypuses showed that the student was acquiring skills faster and with fewer errors than would be expected for an individual learning entirely through independent exploration. Other critics suggested that perhaps the teacher was simply tolerating the presence of the juvenile rather than actively caring for it, that the apparent teaching behaviors might be the teacher simply going about his normal foraging with the student happening to observe and learn incidentally. But, again, the carefully documented evidence of the teacher's altered time budget, his reduced body condition, his active protection behaviors, and his modified foraging techniques during teaching sessions contradicted this interpretation. What no one could dispute was that something remarkable had been documented, and that this single case had revealed capabilities in a species that had been studied for over 200 years without anyone suspecting they might exist. If you've been watching this entire story and you're as amazed as I am by what nature can reveal when we pay close enough attention, do me a huge favor right now and leave a comment telling me what you think about this incredible platypus and his adopted baby, and share this video with your friends and family, because stories like this need to be shared. They remind us that the natural world is full of wonder and complexity that we're only beginning to understand, and they show us that compassion and care can exist in the most unexpected places and in creatures we might never have imagined capable of such profound behaviors. As the student approached her first birthday, Now nearly full-grown and increasingly independent in her foraging, though still maintaining close association with the teacher, Sarah and her team faced a question that would have significant implications for both the research and the conservation message it conveyed. Should they intervene to separate the student from the teacher, to encourage her full independence and eventual dispersal to establish her own territory, as would naturally occur with a young female platypus leaving her mother's care? Or should they allow this unique relationship to continue indefinitely and see what happened, even though this might mean the student never fully dispersed, and might continue to rely on the teacher in ways that could be detrimental to both of them in the long term? After considerable discussion and consultation with platypus experts, wildlife managers and ethicists who specialized in questions of intervention versus non-intervention in wildlife research, the decision was made to allow the relationship to continue without human interference, to document whatever happened as part of understanding the full scope of this unprecedented behavior, while maintaining close monitoring to ensure that neither individual was suffering harm. What happened over the following months surprised everyone once again. The student did gradually spend more time foraging independently, expanding her range beyond the immediate vicinity of the teacher's territory, and by her 14th month, she was observed mating with a young male from a neighboring territory, engaging in the brief aquatic courtship and mating behavior typical of platypuses. But rather than dispersing completely, as would be expected, she established her own burrow system within what had been the teacher's territory, effectively creating an overlapping range, and she continued to interact regularly with the teacher, though now as an independent adult rather than a dependent juvenile. They would still occasionally forage together, still showed grooming behaviors during these interactions, and when the student eventually produced her first clutch of eggs and successfully raised 2 puggles to independence, the teacher was sometimes observed in proximity to the student's breeding burrow, not involved in the care of the young but present in a way that suggested he was aware of and interested in these offspring of his former charge. This multi-generational observation, extending over 3 years from the initial discovery, provided an unprecedented window into platypus social structure, and suggested that these animals, long considered strictly solitary, might actually maintain more complex social relationships than had been recognized, with the teacher-student case being an extreme example that revealed capacities that were perhaps more widely present, but simply expressed more subtly in typical circumstances. Sarah's continued research began documenting other cases of platypuses showing what might be considered tolerance or even coordination in their use of shared habitats, interactions that didn't fit neatly into the solitary, except for breeding model that had dominated platypus literature. She proposed that platypuses might actually exist on a spectrum of sociality, with most individuals being relatively solitary most of the time, but capable of more complex social behaviors under certain circumstances, and that the teacher's adoption of the student represented an extreme manifestation of social capabilities that existed latently in the species but were rarely expressed so dramatically. The story of the teacher and student also had significant practical implications for platypus conservation. Populations of these iconic animals had been declining across much of their range due to habitat destruction, water pollution, drought, conditions intensified by climate change, and predation by introduced species like foxes and cats. Conservation efforts had focused primarily on habitat protection and water quality improvement, which were certainly crucial, but Sarah's research suggested that understanding and protecting the social dimensions of platypus ecology might also be important, that the ability of orphaned juveniles to potentially be adopted by other individuals, even if rare, could provide some resilience to populations facing high mortality rates, and that maintaining sufficient habitat connectivity to allow whatever social interactions did occur could be as important as maintaining water quality in the specific pools where individual platypuses foraged. The international attention the story received also translated into increased funding for platypus research and conservation. Organizations that had struggled for years to raise money for protecting these unusual, but not particularly charismatic, megafauna found that the teacher and student's story had given platypuses a narrative that captured public imagination, and donations increased substantially. The research station where Sarah worked received grants to expand their monitoring efforts. Several PhD students began research projects focused on different aspects of platypus behavior and ecology, and conservation organizations launched education programs using the teacher's story to illustrate both the remarkable nature of platypuses and the importance of protecting the river systems they depended on. 5 years after that rainy March morning, when Sarah first received James's phone call, she published a comprehensive book synthesizing everything that had been learned from the teacher and student case and subsequent research it had inspired. The book, titled The Platypus Who Cared, Discovering Emotion and Intelligence in One of Nature's Strangest Creatures, became an unexpected bestseller, appealing to both scientific, readers interested in animal behavior, and general audiences drawn to the story of these remarkable animals. Sarah dedicated the book to the teacher, who had continued to thrive in his river territory even as he aged into old age for a platypus, and to the student, who had successfully raised multiple litters and whose offspring were now dispersing into surrounding areas, potentially carrying whatever genetic or learned factors had allowed for the remarkable bond she had formed with her adoptive father. The teacher lived to approximately 13 years old, somewhat longer than average for male platypuses in the wild, before he was found dead in his burrow one winter morning, apparently having passed away peacefully in his sleep from natural causes related to age. When Sarah received the news, she felt a profound sadness that surprised her with its intensity. This was a research subject, an animal she had observed and documented but tried to maintain professional distance from. Yet she found herself grieving for this individual who had taught her, and through her work, the entire scientific community, so much about the hidden depths of animal capability and emotion. A small memorial was held at the research station, attended by the researchers, park rangers, and documentary filmmakers who had been touched by the teacher's story. And Sarah read a tribute acknowledging how this one platypus had changed human understanding of his entire species and contributed to broader conversations about how we understand and value the inner lives of animals. The student, now in her prime as an adult female successfully raising young in the territory where she had learned to be a platypus from her adoptive father, continued to be monitored by Sarah and her research team, providing data on how the unusual circumstances of her upbringing might have affected her own behavior as an adult and parent. Interestingly, observers noted that she seemed to show more tolerance for the presence of other platypuses in her foraging areas than was typical, and she was observed on 2 occasions allowing recently dispersed juveniles, not her own offspring, to forage in close proximity to her without the aggression that would normally be expected, as if perhaps she retained some memory or influence from her own experience of being adopted and tolerated by an unrelated adult, though this interpretation remained speculative and would require much more data to confirm. This story, this absolutely true and meticulously documented account of an ordinary platypus in an Australian river who did something extraordinary, reminds us of several profound truths about the world we live in and our relationship with other species. It reminds us that scientific understanding is never complete, that nature always has more secrets to reveal if we remain curious and observant, that the categories and theories we construct to understand animal behavior are simplifications of a much richer and more complex reality, and that every species, no matter how well studied, can still surprise us with capabilities we never suspected existed. It reminds us that the qualities we think of as uniquely human or present only in our closest evolutionary relatives, qualities like empathy, teaching, adoption of unrelated young, sustained commitment to caring for others at personal cost, appear throughout the animal kingdom in diverse forms and contexts, suggesting that these capabilities have deep evolutionary roots, and that the boundary between human and animal minds is far more permeable and complex than we often assume. Before I close out this incredible story, I want you to know that you can be part of protecting animals like the teacher and student and ensuring that rivers remain healthy enough to support platypus populations into the future. Conservation organizations working to protect platypus habitat need support, and even small actions like reducing water pollution, supporting river restoration projects, and spreading awareness about these remarkable animals can make a difference. But right now, what I want you to do is leave a comment below sharing your thoughts on this amazing story. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, so you don't miss more incredible true stories about animal behavior, and share this video with everyone you know. Because stories like this, stories that reveal the hidden complexity and beauty of the natural world, need to be told and retold. They change how we see other species, and ultimately how we treat them and the environments we all share. The legacy of the teacher and student extends beyond the scientific papers and conservation funding they inspired. Their story has been incorporated into school curricula in Australia and internationally as an example of animal behavior and scientific discovery. Children learn about platypuses through the lens of this remarkable individual who chose to care for an orphaned juvenile, and in doing so, revealed truths about his species that had remained hidden for millions of years. Artists have created sculptures, paintings, and children's books depicting the teacher and student, capturing in various media the emotional resonance of their relationship and making it accessible to audiences who might never read a scientific paper, but can connect with a story of compassion and care that transcends the boundaries we usually draw between human and animal experience. The story has become part of Australian natural history folklore, joining other famous animals like the thylacine and the kangaroo in the cultural consciousness of a nation that takes pride in its unique wildlife. Dr. Sarah Chen continues her research on platypuses, now as a full professor with her own research group studying questions of cognition, behavior, and conservation in monotremes. She often reflects on that rainy March morning when she received the call from James, never imagining where it would lead, how one adopted platypus would change her career trajectory, contribute to fundamental shifts in scientific understanding, and touch the hearts of millions of people around the world who saw in the teacher's behavior a reflection of the best qualities we associate with parenthood: protection, teaching, patience, and selfless care for another individual regardless of relationship or personal cost. She keeps a photograph on her office wall, a perfectly timed shot capturing the teacher and students swimming side by side in clear water, sunlight illuminating them from above, the larger platypus slightly ahead, as if leading the way, the smaller one following close behind, trusting, learning, growing into an independent creature capable of continuing the cycle of life in the rivers of Eastern Australia. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the remarkable story of the platypus who changed everything we thought we knew about his species. If this story moved you, inspired you, or simply made you see the natural world a little differently, that's exactly what I hope to achieve with every video on this channel. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and share, and I'll see you in the next incredible true story that reminds us why the natural world is worth protecting, studying, and celebrating in all its unexpected glory.